The National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., receives donations documenting resistance to slavery regularly. But some acquisitions reveal forms of resistance so bold and dangerous they challenge everything we think we know about enslaved people's agency and courage. On a morning in August 2024, archivist Dr. Raymond Cooper opens a package that will lead him to uncover the story of one of the most wanted fugitives in antebellum Virginia, a woman who used fire as a weapon against slavery, who burned plantation property on 5 different estates over 7 years, who evaded capture despite massive manhunts, and who after the Civil War gave testimony documenting arson as a deliberate strategic form of resistance that terrorized slaveholders and struck at the economic foundation of the slave system. The donation comes from a historical society in Richmond, Virginia. The letter explains that while digitizing records from the Virginia State Archives, researchers discovered a file containing wanted posters, court documents, newspaper accounts, and most remarkably, testimony given in 1866 by a woman named Grace, who described herself as the fire setter and provided detailed accounts of using arson as resistance against slavery. Raymond carefully removes the materials from their archival box. The first item is a photograph, styled like an 1870s portrait, showing a young black woman standing in a dimly lit room holding a lit oil lamp. She appears to be in her late teens or early 20s, dressed in a plain, high-buttoned dress with a white rounded collar fastened by a small brooch. Her posture is perfectly still, both hands wrapped around the lamp's glass base, as if presenting it deliberately to the camera. What immediately captures Raymond's attention is her expression. Her eyes lock onto the camera with extraordinary intensity, calm, unblinking, almost solemn, as if she knows something she will not say aloud. The lamp casts a soft glow upward across her face, while the rest of the room sinks into shadow. Behind her, the blurred silhouette of a heavy wooden bed frame fades into darkness. The composition creates a stark contrast between flame and darkness, light and shadow. There's something deliberate about how she holds that lamp, not casually, but centered, like an offering or a declaration. This is not a simple portrait of a domestic servant lighting a room. This is a woman presenting fire as her symbol, her weapon, her story. Raymond turns the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Grace. Richmond, Virginia, 1870. Photograph taken 5 years after emancipation. Known during slavery as the fire setter, who burned property on 5 plantations in Virginia between 1855 and 1862. Most wanted fugitive slave in Virginia, with a reward of $500 for her capture. After emancipation, gave extensive testimony documenting arson as resistance to slavery. And below that, in different handwriting, added much later, they hunted her for 7 years. She burned their barns, their cotton stores, their stables. She cost them tens of thousands of dollars in property damage, and she was never caught. Fire was her weapon, and she wielded it without mercy. Raymond reads the inscription 3 times, his pulse racing. Grace had used arson as a weapon against slavery, burning property on 5 different plantations over 7 years. She had been the most wanted fugitive slave in Virginia, with a $500 reward, an enormous sum indicating how desperately slaveholders wanted her captured. And she had evaded capture throughout the antebellum period, finally gaining permanent freedom when the Civil War ended slavery entirely. Raymond spends the rest of that day examining the other materials in the package. What he finds is extraordinary. Wanted posters offering rewards for Grace's capture, newspaper accounts of mysterious fires on Virginia plantations, court records from trials of enslaved people accused of arson, and most importantly, a complete transcript of testimony Grace gave in 1866 to federal officials investigating resistance to slavery. From the earliest wanted poster Raymond finds, dated 1856, $100 reward. Run away from the subscriber's plantation in Henrico County. A Negro woman named Grace, age approximately 18 years, of medium height and build. Grace absconded on the night of September 12th, the same night a fire of suspicious origin destroyed the plantation's tobacco barn, containing this year's harvest, valued at $3,000. It is believed Grace set this fire before fleeing. She is considered dangerous and should not be approached without caution. Anyone capturing and returning Grace will receive $100 reward. Thomas Whitfield, proprietor. Raymond's hands shake as he reads. Grace had been approximately 18 years old when she burned her first plantation building and escaped. The reward of $100 was substantial, roughly equivalent to $3,000 today, indicating how seriously the plantation owner took both her escape and the property destruction. He finds a newspaper account from the Richmond Inquirer, October 1856. Suspicious fire destroys tobacco barn. A fire of unknown origin destroyed the tobacco barn on the Whitfield plantation in Henrico County on the night of September 12th, destroying the entire tobacco harvest, valued at approximately $3,000. The fire occurred on the same night that a slave woman named Grace absconded from the plantation. Authorities suspect the fire was deliberately set by Grace before her escape, though no evidence has been recovered. This incident follows a pattern of suspicious fires on Virginia plantations in recent years, leading some to suspect organized arson by slaves seeking to strike at their master's property and profits. Raymond contacts Dr. Helen Martinez, a historian at the University of Virginia who specializes in slave resistance in Virginia, particularly forms of resistance that went beyond running away: sabotage, work slowdowns, poisoning, and arson. Helen has spent decades researching how enslaved people fought back against the system through methods that struck at slaveholders' economic interests, while often avoiding immediate physical confrontation that would result in severe punishment or death. Helen calls him back within an hour. Grace, the fire setter. I've found scattered references to her in my research. She was legendary in antebellum Virginia, a woman who burned plantation property and disappeared, who was hunted for years but never caught. If you found her complete testimony documenting her use of arson as resistance, this is groundbreaking. Arson was one of the most feared forms of slave resistance because it was so difficult to prevent or trace, and it struck directly at slaveholders' wealth. Send me everything. Raymond scans all the materials and emails them to Helen. They arrange to meet at the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond, where Helen has already requested plantation records, court documents, newspaper archives, and any available documentation about arson and slave resistance in 1850s, 1860s Virginia. Over the following days, Raymond and Helen piece together Grace's story through the wanted posters, newspaper accounts, court records, and her own testimony. What emerges is a portrait of extraordinary courage, strategic thinking, and a 7-year campaign of resistance through fire that terrorized Virginia slaveholders and contributed to the growing sense among white Southerners that slavery was becoming economically unsustainable and impossible to maintain. From wanted posters and newspaper accounts, they traced Grace's movements and actions between 1856 and 1862. After burning the tobacco barn on the Whitfield plantation and escaping in September 1856, Grace apparently made her way to another county in Virginia, where she either found work as a free black person using false papers, or where she was harbored by free black communities or sympathetic individuals. But she didn't stop with one act of resistance. Over the next 6 years, 4 more plantations in Virginia experienced devastating fires, and in each case, there were reports of a black woman matching Grace's description being seen in the area shortly before the fire, then disappearing. From the Richmond Inquirer, March 1858. Devastating fire at Patterson Plantation. A fire destroyed the cotton storehouse at the Patterson Plantation in Chesterfield County on March 3rd, destroying processed cotton ready for market valued at approximately $5,000. Several witnesses reported seeing an unknown Negro woman near the property in the days before the fire. Authorities believe this may be the same woman, known as Grace, who is suspected of setting fire to the Whitfield Plantation's tobacco barn in 1856. The reward for Grace's capture has been increased to $200. Plantation owners throughout the region are warned to be vigilant against this dangerous incendiary. From April 1859, another suspicious fire, another plantation ruined. The stables at the Morrison Plantation in Hanover County burned completely on April 15th, killing 12 valuable horses and destroying equipment valued at approximately $4,000. A Negro woman matching the description of the fugitive Grace was reportedly seen near the property the day before the fire. Authorities are convinced that Grace is systematically targeting Virginia plantations and using fire as a weapon to strike at slavery's economic foundation. The reward for her capture has been increased to $300. From September 1860, Grace strikes again. The corn crib and grain storehouse at the Beaufort Plantation in Goochland County burned on September 7th, destroying the plantation's grain reserves valued at approximately $3,500. As with previous suspicious fires on Virginia plantations, reports place a woman matching Grace's description in the area shortly before the fire. The reward for Grace's capture now stands at $400. Plantation owners are taking extraordinary precautions, posting guards at night, and securing all buildings that might be targets for arson. From November 1862, massive fire destroys Thornton Plantation buildings. A fire at the Thornton Plantation in Loessa County on November 2nd destroyed multiple buildings including a tobacco barn, cotton storehouse, and equipment shed, causing damage estimated at $8,000. This is the most destructive of the suspicious fires that have plagued Virginia plantations over the past 6 years. Authorities believe Grace, the fugitive slave woman suspected of setting all these fires, is responsible. The reward for her capture has been increased to $500, the highest reward ever offered for a fugitive slave woman in Virginia. Despite years of searching, Grace has never been apprehended, and her whereabouts remain unknown. Raymond and Helen calculate the total property damage from the 5 fires Grace is suspected of setting. Approximately $2,500, equivalent to over $700,000 today. This was an enormous economic blow to 5 wealthy plantation owners, and it sent shockwaves through Virginia's slaveholding class. They find evidence of the panic Grace's campaign created. From plantation records and correspondence between slaveholders, they find letters discussing the incendiary Negro woman and the fear she inspired. From a letter written by a Virginia plantation owner in 1861, We live in constant fear of fire. Every unexplained noise at night, every whiff of smoke, sends us into panic. That Negro woman, Grace, who has burned 5 plantations over the past 6 years, has made us understand how vulnerable we are. We cannot guard every building every night. We cannot prevent a determined individual from striking at our property. She has cost Virginia slaveholders over $20,000 in losses, but the true cost is the fear she has created. How can we maintain a system that depends on keeping Negroes submissive and controlled, when a single woman can wreak such havoc and evade capture for years? The most important document Raymond and Helen examine is Grace's own testimony, given in Richmond in March 1866, just 10 months after the war ended. The testimony is extensive, over 40 pages, and provides a detailed, first-person account of using arson as resistance, explaining Grace's strategic thinking, how she chose her targets, how she evaded capture, and why she believed fire was an effective weapon against slavery. From Grace's testimony, delivered March 1866, "My name is Grace. I chose this name for myself after emancipation because grace is what I never received under slavery, but what I have tried to show to others in freedom. During slavery, I was known by the name my enslaver gave me, but I have left that name behind along with bondage. I am here to provide testimony about my use of arson as resistance to slavery. Between 1856 and 1862, I deliberately set fires that destroyed property on 5 plantations in Virginia. I caused approximately $2,500 in damage to slaveholders' property. I was hunted for 7 years. Rewards totaling $500 were offered for my capture. I was never caught. I provide this testimony because I want history to record that enslaved people did not submit passively to our bondage. We resisted in many ways, and one of the most effective forms of resistance was striking at slaveholders' economic interests through destruction of their property. Fire was a weapon that even the most powerless person could wield. It required no money, no allies, no special knowledge, only courage and careful planning. I will explain how I came to use fire as resistance, how I chose my targets, how I set the fires, how I evaded capture, and why I believed this form of resistance was effective in weakening the institution of slavery. I was born enslaved in Virginia in approximately 1838. I do not know the exact date of my birth or the names of my parents. I was separated from my mother when I was very young and sold to the Whitfield plantation in Henrico County when I was approximately 8 years old. I worked as a house servant, which gave me opportunities to observe the plantation's operations and to learn things that field workers might not have known. When I was approximately 16, Thomas Whitfield attempted to force himself on me sexually. I refused and fought back, scratching his face and escaping from the room where he had cornered me. Whitfield had me severely whipped as punishment for resisting him, 50 lashes that left permanent scars on my back. After that whipping, I understood clearly that I had no protection, no rights, no recourse. Whitfield could rape me whenever he chose, could have me beaten for any reason or no reason, could sell me or kill me and face no consequences. I was property with no power to defend myself through legal or social means, but I also understood that I was not powerless. I could resist. I could fight back. I could strike at Whitfield in ways he might not expect or prevent. I began observing the plantation's vulnerabilities. The tobacco barn where the harvested crop was stored before being taken to market was isolated, far from the main house, minimally guarded. A fire there would destroy the year's crop and cause enormous financial damage. And if the fire occurred when I was not on the plantation, suspicion might not immediately fall on me. I began planning my escape and my act of resistance simultaneously. I would set fire to the tobacco barn, then flee the plantation. The fire would be discovered, the alarm would be raised, and in the chaos of fighting the fire, my absence might not be immediately noticed. By the time Whitfield realized I had run away, I would have hours of head start. On the night of September 12th, 1856, I executed my plan. I waited until after midnight when everyone was asleep. I went to the tobacco barn carrying materials I had secretly collected: dry straw, a small amount of lamp oil I had gradually taken from the house over several weeks, and matches I had stolen from the kitchen. I set fire to the tobacco barn in multiple places to ensure it would burn completely before the fire could be brought under control. The barn was full of dried tobacco leaves from that year's harvest, highly flammable material that would burn intensely. I watched the fire catch and spread, making sure it was established and could not be easily extinguished. Then I ran. I had prepared a small bundle of food and one extra dress, hidden in the woods. I collected this bundle and began moving north, away from the plantation, traveling by night and hiding during the day. Behind me, I could see the glow of the fire against the sky. I could hear shouts and the ringing of the plantation bell as people woke and tried to fight the fire. But by then it was too late. The tobacco barn burned completely, destroying the entire year's harvest, worth approximately $3,000. I traveled for 3 days, moving carefully, avoiding roads and settlements where I might be spotted. I had no clear destination, only a determination to get as far from Whitfield's plantation as possible. I knew that once Whitfield realized I was gone, and that the fire had occurred the same night I ran, he would conclude I had set the fire deliberately. He would pursue me. Rewards would be posted. I would be hunted. On the 4th day, I reached a settlement where I knew free black people lived. I approached a black church and explained my situation to the minister. He provided me with temporary shelter and, crucially, with false papers identifying me as a free black woman named Sarah Johnson. These papers were not perfect. They would not hold up under serious scrutiny, but they allowed me to move through Virginia with some degree of cover. For the next year and a half, I worked as a laundress and domestic servant in various Virginia towns, using my false papers to present myself as free. I saved every penny I earned, knowing I might need money to travel or to hide if I was recognized. But I also watched. I listened. I paid attention to which plantations were large and profitable, which ones treated their enslaved people with particular cruelty, which ones were vulnerable to the kind of strike I could deliver. I began planning my next act of resistance. In March 1858, I set fire to the cotton storehouse on the Patterson plantation in Chesterfield County. I chose this target because I had learned that Patterson was particularly brutal. He had recently sold 3 children away from their parents because the parents had protested their treatment. I wanted to strike at Patterson's profits, to make him pay economically for his cruelty. I approached the plantation at night, having observed the property during previous days to understand the layout and guard patterns. The cotton storehouse was located away from residential buildings, making it a safe target that would not endanger enslaved people who lived on the property. The storehouse contained processed cotton ready for market, extremely valuable and highly flammable. I set the fire and disappeared before the alarm was raised. The storehouse burned completely, destroying approximately $5,000 worth of cotton. I was 2 counties away by the time the fire was discovered. After this second fire, I began to see newspaper accounts describing the fires as possibly related and speculating that the same person might be responsible. I saw wanted posters with descriptions of me and increasing rewards. I understood that I was becoming known, that authorities were actively searching for me, that the risk of capture was increasing. But I also understood that what I was doing was effective. These fires were causing real economic damage to slaveholders. More importantly, they were creating fear and uncertainty. Plantation owners throughout Virginia were suddenly aware that they were vulnerable, that their property could be destroyed, that a single determined person could strike at them and evade capture. I set 3 more fires between 1859 and 1862 at the Morrison, Beaufort, and Thornton plantations. Each time, I carefully observed the target property. I chose buildings that would cause maximum economic damage while minimizing risk to enslaved people. I set fires that would burn intensely and spread quickly, and I disappeared before the alarm could be raised. With each fire, the rewards for my capture increased. Eventually, there was a $500 reward, the highest amount ever offered for a fugitive slave woman in Virginia. Slave patrols searched for me constantly. My description was circulated throughout the state. But I was never caught. I evaded capture through several strategies. First, I changed my appearance frequently. I would alter my hair, wear different styles of clothing, sometimes bind my chest to appear more masculine, adopt different manners of speech and movement. The wanted posters described me as I had appeared in 1856, but by 1860 I looked quite different. Second, I relied on the networks of free black people and some sympathetic white people who harbored fugitives. After each fire, I would move to a different area of Virginia and find shelter with people who were willing to hide me, temporarily despite the risk. Third, I was careful never to stay in one place long enough to become too familiar or to attract attention. I would work in a town for a few months, save money, then move on before anyone could begin to suspect my true identity. Fourth, I took advantage of the fact that authorities were looking for a fugitive runaway slave, not a free black woman with papers. As long as I carried my false papers and behaved as a free person would, confident, not deferential, able to move freely, I was less likely to be stopped and questioned. I continued this pattern until late 1862, when the Civil War was well underway and Union forces were active in Virginia. At that point, I made my way to Union lines and declared myself a freedwoman. I spent the rest of the war in contraband camps and working for Union forces. When the war ended and emancipation became permanent, I settled in Richmond. I am now working as a seamstress and building a free life. But I wanted to provide this testimony to document that enslaved people resisted our bondage through direct action, that fire was an effective weapon against slavery's economic foundation, and that even the most wanted fugitive could evade capture if she was careful, strategic, and determined. I am asked sometimes whether I regret the property destruction I caused, whether I feel guilty about the economic losses suffered by plantation owners. I do not. Every dollar of property damage I caused was a dollar taken from men who had stolen my labor, my freedom, and my bodily autonomy. Every fire I set struck at the economic system that kept millions of people in bondage. The only regret I have is that I could not have set more fires, could not have caused more damage to the institution of slavery. I am also asked whether setting fires was dangerous, whether I risked being killed if I had been caught. Yes, it was dangerous. If I had been captured, I would almost certainly have been executed. Virginia had laws mandating death penalty for slaves who committed arson. But I chose to take that risk because living in slavery was also dangerous, was in fact a slow death of the spirit, if not always of the body. I chose active resistance with its risks over passive submission to bondage. I provide this testimony in hope that future generations will understand that enslaved people fought back against our oppression in every way available to us. Some people resisted through running away to freedom. Some resisted through work slowdowns and sabotage. Some resisted through rebellion and violence. I resisted through arson, through striking at slaveholders' property and profits, through creating fear and uncertainty, through demonstrating that the system could not protect its own economic interests when determined people chose to attack those interests. Fire was my weapon. I wielded it strategically and effectively. I was never caught, despite being the most wanted fugitive slave woman in Virginia. And I am proud of what I did to resist slavery and to strike at the economic foundation of that evil system. Raymond finishes reading with his hands shaking. Grace's testimony is one of the most remarkable accounts of slave resistance he has ever encountered, not just because of the boldness of her actions, but because of her clear strategic thinking, her careful planning, and her articulation of why arson was an effective form of resistance. Raymond and Helen spend weeks researching what happened to Grace after her testimony. They find her listed in the 1870 census in Richmond. Grace Freeman, age 32, occupation seamstress, able to read and write, owns property valued at $400. The property ownership is significant. Grace had accumulated substantial resources in just 5 years of freedom. They find records showing that Grace married in 1868 to a man named Isaiah, who had served in the United States Colored Troops during the war. Census records show them with 2 children by 1880. They find that Grace remained active in the black community in Richmond, working with organizations that supported formerly enslaved people, and speaking occasionally about her experiences. From a black newspaper in Richmond, they find an article from 1878 where Grace was interviewed about her acts of resistance. Mrs. Grace Freeman, who resides in Richmond and operates a successful seamstress business, was one of the most feared names in Virginia during slavery. Between 1856 and 1862, Mrs. Freeman set fires that destroyed property on 5 plantations, causing over $20,000 in damage and terrorizing slaveholders throughout the state. She was hunted for 7 years, with rewards totaling $500 offered for her capture, but she was never caught. Mrs. Freeman's campaign of arson demonstrated that enslaved people could strike effectively at slavery's economic foundation, and that even the most wanted fugitive could evade capture through careful planning and courage. Mrs. Freeman now lives peacefully in freedom, but she carries the distinction of being one of the most effective resistors of slavery in Virginia's history. Grace lived until 1904, dying at age 66. Her obituary in a black newspaper in Richmond was extensive. Mrs. Grace Freeman, legendary resistor of slavery, dies at 66. Mrs. Freeman, who passed away Wednesday at her home in Richmond, was one of the most remarkable figures of the slavery era. Between 1856 and 1862, Mrs. Freeman set fires that destroyed property on 5 Virginia plantations, causing approximately $23,500 in damage to slaveholders. She was the most wanted fugitive slave woman in Virginia, with rewards of $500 offered for her capture. But she was never caught. After emancipation, Mrs. Freeman gave detailed testimony documenting her use of arson as resistance, helping establish the historical record of how enslaved people fought back against their oppression. Mrs. Freeman lived in freedom for nearly 40 years, married, raised children, operated a successful business, and contributed to her community. She will be remembered as a woman who refused to accept slavery, who fought back with courage and strategic brilliance, and who helped prove that resistance was possible even under the most oppressive circumstances. Over the following months, Raymond and Helen worked to create an exhibition honoring Grace's resistance, while honestly documenting both the effectiveness of arson as a resistance strategy and the dangers involved. They locate Grace's descendants through genealogists, finding a great-great-grandson living in Richmond who has family stories about Grace, but never knew the full extent of her campaign of resistance. 15 months after Raymond first opened that package, the National Museum of African American History and Culture opens the exhibition Fire as Freedom, Grace Freeman and Arson as Resistance to Slavery. The exhibition occupies a major gallery designed to honor Grace while examining the broader context of arson as slave resistance. The centerpiece is the 1870 photograph, Grace holding the lit lamp, her intense gaze meeting the camera, fire and darkness creating stark contrasts around her. A detailed explanation accompanies the image. Grace Freeman was photographed in 1870, 5 years after emancipation. During slavery, between 1856 and 1862, she deliberately set fires that destroyed property on 5 Virginia plantations, causing approximately $23,500 in damage. She was the most wanted fugitive slave woman in Virginia, with rewards totaling $500 offered for her capture. But she evaded capture for 7 years through careful planning and strategy. In this photograph, Grace holds a lamp, a symbolic reference to her use of fire as a weapon against slavery. Her testimony documented arson as deliberate, strategic resistance that struck at slavery's economic foundation. The exhibition tells Grace's complete story through her own testimony, wanted posters, newspaper accounts, plantation records, and historical context about arson as slave resistance. The progression of wanted posters from $100 in 1856 to $500 in 1862 documents how seriously slaveholders took her campaign and how desperately they wanted her captured. One section displays newspaper accounts of each fire Grace set, along with maps showing the locations and photographs or drawings of similar plantation buildings to help visitors understand the targets Grace chose and the damage she caused. Another section examines Grace's strategic thinking, how she chose targets that would cause maximum economic damage while minimizing risk to enslaved people, how she planned her escapes, how she changed her appearance and identity to evade capture. The exhibition presents Grace as a strategic thinker and planner, not just an angry person lashing out impulsively. The exhibition includes broader context about arson as slave resistance. Historical records show that arson was one of the most feared forms of resistance by slaveholders because it was difficult to prevent, hard to trace, and struck directly at property and profits. The exhibition documents dozens of suspicious fires on southern plantations during the antebellum period, showing that Grace was part of a broader pattern of resistance through property destruction. A section on risk acknowledges that arson was extremely dangerous. enslaved people caught setting fires were usually executed. The exhibition includes court records from trials of enslaved people accused of arson, showing the severe punishments imposed. This context makes Grace's success in evading capture for 7 years even more remarkable. The exhibition traces Grace's life after emancipation, her marriage, her business, her children, her continued involvement in the black community in Richmond. It shows that Grace was able to build a full, successful life in freedom after years of being Virginia's most wanted fugitive. A video plays continuously featuring historians discussing arson as slave resistance, the economic impact of property destruction on the slave system, and the significance of Grace's testimony in documenting this form of resistance. Grace's great-great-grandson shares family stories and reflects on his ancestors' courage. On opening day, Raymond stands in the gallery, watching visitors engage with the exhibition. He sees people study the photograph, understanding the symbolism of Grace, holding that lamp, fire as her weapon, light emerging from darkness. A woman who refused to be powerless, presenting the tool of her resistance. Helen stands beside him, looking at the image. Grace was 32 years old when this photograph was taken, she says quietly. She'd burned 5 plantations, caused over $20,000 in property damage, been hunted for 7 years, and never been caught. She could have disappeared into anonymity after the war, but instead, she chose to give detailed testimony, documenting exactly what she did and why she did it. Look at her face in this photograph. There's no apology, no shame, no regret. There's strength and pride. She's holding that lamp like she's saying, "This was my weapon. This is how I fought back, and I'd do it again." Grace's great-great-grandson, Marcus Freeman, stands with them, looking at his ancestor's photograph. "My family always said Grace was fearless," he says. "We knew she'd been involved in resistance during slavery, and that she'd been hunted but never caught. But I never knew the specifics, that she set 5 fires over 7 years, that she caused $23,500 in damage, that there was a $500 reward for her capture. That's extraordinary. She struck at slavery's economic foundation, created fear among slaveholders, proved that resistance was possible. And she survived to build a life in freedom, and to document what she did so we would know. That's an incredible legacy." A young black woman approaches, after spending a long time reading Grace's testimony. "Thank you for this exhibition," she says. "We learn about slave resistance, but it's usually presented as either running away or violent rebellion." Learning about Grace using arson strategically, choosing targets carefully, planning escapes, evading capture for years, shows that enslaved people could be strategic thinkers and effective resistors. Grace fought back on her own terms, using the tools available to her, and she was successful. That's powerful. An elderly white man stops to read the newspaper accounts of the fires for a long time. "Grace caused over $20,000 in property damage," he says. "That's equivalent to over $700,000 today. She struck a real economic blow against 5 plantation owners. And reading these newspaper accounts, you can feel the panic among Virginia slaveholders, the fear that this one woman was making them vulnerable. Grace proved that the system couldn't protect itself when determined people chose to attack it." Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, understanding that Grace's story represents a form of resistance that was effective, strategic, and deeply threatening to the slave system, striking at the economic foundation of slavery through destruction of property, that slaveholders could not fully protect. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Raymond walks through the gallery one more time. He stops in front of Grace's photograph, looking at her intense gaze, at the lamp she holds with such deliberate symbolism. He thinks about Grace, approximately 18 years old when she set her first fire and escaped, hunted for 7 years with increasingly large rewards offered for her capture, burning 5 plantations and causing $23,500 in damage, evading capture through careful planning and constant vigilance, reaching freedom when the war ended, giving detailed testimony documenting her resistance, living in freedom for nearly 40 years, and building a successful life. He thinks about the 5 plantation owners whose property Grace destroyed: Thomas Whitfield, Patterson, Morrison, Beaufort, and Thornton, men whose wealth was built on enslaved labor, who suddenly found themselves vulnerable to a form of attack they could not prevent, who offered massive rewards, but could never capture the woman who struck at their profits and their sense of security. And he thinks about the broader significance of Grace's resistance, how it demonstrated that enslaved people could fight back effectively against slavery's economic foundation, how it created fear and uncertainty among slaveholders, how it contributed to the growing sense that slavery was becoming unsustainable when enslaved people chose to resist. The photograph waited 154 years to tell Grace's full story. The image that shows a woman holding a lamp with such deliberate symbolism has become testimony to courage, to strategic resistance, to the use of fire as a weapon against oppression, and to one woman's refusal to accept powerlessness. Now the photograph has fulfilled a purpose Grace surely intended when she posed with that lamp. Her story has been told, her resistance has been documented, her strategic thinking has been recognized, and future generations can understand that enslaved people fought back in every way available to them, that even the most wanted fugitive could evade capture through courage and planning, and that striking at slavery's economic foundation through property destruction was an effective form of resistance that terrified slaveholders and contributed to the eventual collapse of the system. As visitors file past the image one last time, many stopping to look at Grace's unwavering gaze and see the determination behind her choice to document her resistance, the pride behind her symbolic presentation of fire as her weapon. Raymond thinks about all the other enslaved people who used arson as resistance, all the other mysterious fires on southern plantations that represented deliberate acts of resistance rather than accidents, all the other stories of people who fought back against slavery by striking at its economic foundation. Grace Freeman, born enslaved approximately 1838, set 5 fires destroying plantation property between 1856 to 1862, caused approximately $23,500 in damage, was Virginia's most wanted fugitive slave woman, with $500 in rewards offered for her capture, evaded capture for 7 years through strategic planning and courage, reached freedom when the war ended, gave detailed testimony documenting her resistance, lived in freedom until 1904, having proved that resistance was possible and effective. Her story has been told. Her courage has been honored. And Raymond is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that Grace Freeman is remembered not just as a fugitive who ran away, but as a strategic resistor who used fire as a weapon against slavery, who struck effectively at the system's economic foundation, and who documented her resistance so that future generations would know that enslaved people fought back with intelligence, courage, and devastating effectiveness.